Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when science gives up on someone? When 17 of the most prestigious physicians in the country shake their heads, pack their leather bags, and walk away from a dying child? What remains when hope itself has been pronounced dead? Tonight, I need to share with you a story that was deliberately erased from history books. A story so powerful, so threatening to the established order, that powerful men spent fortunes trying to make sure you would never hear it. But here we are. And I discovered something in forgotten archives that will change everything you thought you knew about medicine, about slavery, and about the human capacity for both cruelty and redemption. This is not just another historical account. This is a story about a 12-year-old boy whose hands held secrets that European universities couldn't teach. A boy whose name was taken from him, whose family was stolen, whose humanity was denied. And yet, he possessed something that gold couldn't buy and power couldn't destroy. If this kind of story resonates with you, if you believe that truth deserves to be uncovered no matter how uncomfortable it makes us, then hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to reveal will stay with you long after this video ends. The girl was dying. The doctors had failed. And in the slave quarters, a child was about to change history forever. Let me take you there. The ruins still stand today, though few know what to look for. In the outskirts of what is now Charleston, South Carolina, where Spanish moss drapes from ancient oaks like the tattered veils of widows, there exists a crumbling foundation of red brick and mortar. The locals call it the Ashworth Place, though the family abandoned it generations ago. If you press your ear to the remaining walls during certain autumn evenings, old-timers say you can still hear something, not quite music, not quite weeping, but something in between. The Ashworth Plantation in 1847 was not merely a farm. It was an empire of pain built on 4,000 acres of Carolina low country. Baron Theodore Ashworth, for he styled himself with European titles despite being born in Virginia, had constructed something more than a cotton operation. He had built a monument to his own perceived greatness. A temple where human beings were reduced to machinery and suffering was as common as the morning dew. The main house rose 3 stories high with white columns that seemed to pierce the sky itself. 16 rooms, crystal chandeliers imported from Paris, a library containing books that the Baron had never read but displayed like trophies. And behind the grand facade, invisible to visitors who came for elaborate dinner parties, stretched the true heart of Ashworth. 237 enslaved souls whose labor, blood, and tears built everything the Baron called his own. The quarters where these souls existed, for one cannot call such an existence living, consisted of 12 wooden structures arranged in 2 neat rows. Each cabin measured no more than 16 feet by 18 feet, yet housed between 8 and 14 people. The floors were packed earth. The walls had gaps wide enough for winter winds to slice through like knives. There were no windows, only holes covered with scraps of burlap when the cold became unbearable, and it was in the smallest of these cabins, the one closest to the swamp where the mosquitoes bred thick as smoke, that a boy named by his captors as Samuel, but who remembered being called Kwame in a language he was forbidden to speak, spent his nights listening to sounds that no child should know. The crack of leather on flesh, the screams that came at unpredictable hours, the heavy footsteps of overseers whose boots were instruments of terror. But Samuel also listened to other sounds, sounds that came from his grandmother, a woman called Mama Essie by everyone on the plantation. She was ancient by the standards of enslaved people, perhaps 60 years old, perhaps more, for records of such things were not kept for those considered property. Her hands were gnarled from decades of field work, but her mind remained sharp as the blade of a harvesting knife. At night, when the overseers were drunk in their own quarters and the main house had gone dark, Mama Essie would teach. She would take Samuel's small hands in her own and show him which plants to pick and when. She would press leaves to his nose and make him memorize their scent. She would grind roots between stones and explain what each powder could do. This one for fever, that one for pain, another for the bleeding that wouldn't stop. The white man doctors, she would whisper, her voice barely louder than breath itself. They learned from books written by dead men who never touched the earth. But our people, we learn from the earth itself. The earth doesn't lie, child. The earth knows how to heal what man has broken. Samuel absorbed everything. His young mind became a repository of knowledge that stretched back across the ocean, through generations of healers who had never worn the chains he wore but whose wisdom flowed in his blood like a river that could not be dammed. By the time he was 12 years old, Samuel had become something the plantation could not explain, and therefore feared. The enslaved community sought him out in secret, for the fever that wouldn't break, for the wounds that wouldn't close, for the births that had become complicated. And Samuel would work his quiet medicine, using plants he gathered in the hours before dawn, combining them in ways that Mama Essie had taught him, and in ways that came to him in dreams that felt like memories of places he had never been. The overseers noticed that the slaves under Samuel's secret care recovered faster than those who received no treatment at all. They noticed, but they said nothing. For to acknowledge the boy's gift would be to acknowledge that he possessed something they did not. And such an acknowledgement was intolerable. If you want to follow more cases like this, cases that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The Baron's daughter was named Elizabeth. She was 7 years old in the autumn of 1847, with golden hair that her mother brushed 100 strokes each night, and blue eyes that reflected the Carolina sky. She was, by all accounts, a sweet child, one of the few members of the Ashworth family who had ever shown kindness to the enslaved people who surrounded her. The servants who worked inside the main house whispered that little Miss Elizabeth would sometimes sneak bread from the kitchen to give to the children in the quarters. She would wave at them from the upstairs window when she thought no one was watching. Once, she had even asked her father why the colored children couldn't come to her birthday party, a question that had earned her a sharp reprimand and a week confined to her room. Perhaps it was this small streak of humanity that made what happened next feel so cruel. Perhaps the universe, in its dark wisdom, chose the one innocent member of that household to test the limits of everyone around her. It began with a cough. Nothing remarkable at first, the kind of cough that children develop when the seasons change and the nights grow cold. Her mother, the Baroness Catherine, administered the standard remedies: honey and lemon, warm compresses, rest in the enormous canopy bed that had been imported from England. But the cough did not subside. It deepened. It became something that shook Elizabeth's small frame like a demon trying to escape from within her chest. Within a week, she could no longer leave her bed. Within 2 weeks, she could barely eat. The first physician arrived from Charleston. Dr. Harold Pemberton was a man of considerable reputation, educated at the finest medical schools in Philadelphia and London. He examined the child with the confidence of someone who had never truly faced his own limitations. "A simple case of consumption," he declared. "Rest, fresh air, and this tincture I shall prepare. She will recover within the month." She did not recover within the month. She grew worse. The second physician was summoned, then the third. They came from Savannah and Richmond, from Atlanta and New Orleans. They came with their black bags and their Latin terminology and their absolute certainty that they understood the human body better than anyone who lacked their credentials. They bled her with leeches until her skin was pale as the sheets she lay upon. They administered mercury until her gums bled and her teeth loosened. They fed her compounds of arsenic and antimony that made her vomit what little food she could keep down. They blistered her chest with hot glasses and covered her in poultices that burned her skin. And still, Elizabeth grew worse. By the time the 17th physician had come and gone, leaving behind nothing but another astronomical bill and another shrug of defeated shoulders, little Elizabeth Ashworth could no longer speak. Her breathing had become a ragged, desperate sound that echoed through the silent hallways of the great house. Her weight had dropped so severely that her bones pressed against her skin like tent poles against thin canvas. Her golden hair had fallen out in clumps, whether from the disease or from the treatments, no one could say. The Baroness Catherine had stopped sleeping. She sat by her daughter's bedside day and night, praying to a God who seemed deaf to her supplications. The Baron himself had withdrawn to his study, where he drank bourbon and stared at the walls, unable to face the death that had taken up residence in his home. The house slaves moved through the hallways like ghosts, speaking in whispers, avoiding the room where the child was dying. They knew what the family knew, Elizabeth Ashworth would not see her 8th birthday. The only question was whether she would survive the week. It was in this atmosphere of absolute despair that a housemaid named Celia made a decision that would change everything. Celia was 32 years old, born on the Ashworth plantation to parents who had been sold away when she was barely old enough to remember their faces. She had been raised in the big house, trained from childhood to be invisible while performing the most intimate services for the family. She dressed the Baroness each morning. She brushed Elizabeth's golden hair each night. She had watched the child grow from infancy, had loved her with the fierce secret love that enslaved women were forced to hide behind masks of servitude, and now she was watching that child die, piece by piece, while men who called themselves healers did nothing but hasten the end. Celia knew about Samuel. Everyone in the quarters knew about Samuel. They knew about the miracles he performed with nothing but plants and whispered prayers. They knew that his touch had saved lives that should have been lost, and they knew that speaking of such things to the white folks was absolutely forbidden. But as she watched Elizabeth's chest rise and fall with increasingly labored breaths, Celia made her choice. She found Samuel at dusk, gathering herbs at the edge of the swamp where the cypress trees created a cathedral of shadows. He looked up at her approach, his 12-year-old face carrying the weight of wisdom that had no business residing in someone so young. "They say the little miss is dying," Celia said, her voice trembling. Samuel nodded. He had heard the whispers. Everyone had. "The white doctors can't save her." "White doctors don't know how to save," Samuel replied, and there was no arrogance in his voice, only a statement of fact as plain as the setting sun. "They know how to cut and burn and poison. They don't know how to heal." Celia knelt before him, a grown woman kneeling before a child, and she took his small hands in hers. "Can you save her?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. His eyes, dark and deep as the swamp water, seemed to look beyond Celia, beyond the trees, beyond the world itself. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if I try and she dies, they'll say I killed her. They'll hang me from the oak tree by the quarters, and they'll make everyone watch." Celia felt tears streaming down her face. She knew he was right. She knew the risk was almost certainly fatal for this child who had done nothing wrong except be born with knowledge his captors couldn't comprehend. "And if you don't try," she whispered, "she dies anyway, and we all have to watch that too." Samuel looked at her for a long time. Then he looked toward the big house where candlelight flickered in an upstairs window like a dying star. "Bring me to her," he said. "Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed." The story of how Samuel entered the Ashworth Main house would be debated for generations to come. Some said Celia simply walked him through the servants' entrance in the dead of night. Others claimed that the Baroness herself, driven mad by grief, had summoned him after hearing whispers from the kitchen staff. There was even a tale that the Baron had drunkenly ordered his overseer to bring that witch doctor boy as a final desperate act before accepting his daughter's death. What is known, documented in the diary of a neighbor who visited the household in the weeks that followed, is that sometime in the early hours of November 14, 1847, an enslaved boy of approximately 12 years entered the bedroom of Elizabeth Ashworth. The room was thick with the smell of sickness and the useless remedies that had been applied by 17 physicians. Candles burned on every surface, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. The Baroness sat in a chair by the bed, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow, her once elegant dress stained with tears and the various fluids of nursing a dying child. She did not object when Samuel approached the bed. Perhaps she was too exhausted to object. Perhaps some part of her recognized that nothing could make things worse than they already were. Perhaps in that moment of absolute desperation, the walls of race and status that defined every interaction in her world simply crumbled away, leaving nothing but a mother's willingness to accept help from any source. Samuel stood at the foot of the bed and looked at the child who lay there. Elizabeth was barely recognizable as the girl who had once snuck bread to the quarters children. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, punctuated by wet, gurgling sounds that spoke of fluid filling her lungs. Her eyes, when they opened, were glazed and unfocused. For a long moment, Samuel simply watched. Then he did something that no physician had done in 8 weeks of treatment. He listened. Not with a stethoscope. He had never seen such an instrument and would not have known how to use one. He listened with his hands, pressing them gently to Elizabeth's chest, her back, her abdomen. He listened with his nose, smelling her breath, her skin, the texture of her sweat. He listened with eyes that had been trained to see patterns in nature that European medicine had never learned to recognize. "This is not consumption," he said finally, his young voice steady, despite the enormity of what he was about to attempt. The white doctors looked for what they expected to find. They didn't look for what was actually there. "Then what is it?" the Baroness whispered, the first words she had spoken to an enslaved person in a tone that suggested she considered them human. "The swamp fever," Samuel said. "It hides. It makes itself look like other sicknesses. The medicines your doctors gave her made her weaker, made it easier for the fever to spread. They were trying to cure a disease she didn't have while feeding the one she did." He reached into a cloth sack that Celia had carried for him and began removing items that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone unfamiliar with their properties. Dried bark from a tree that grew only in the deepest part of the swamp. Leaves from a plant that the enslaved community called fever break. A powder ground from roots that Mama Essie had taught him to prepare under the full moon. And something else. A small vial of dark liquid that had been passed down through 4 generations, carried across the ocean in the twisted hair of an ancestor, whose name had been deliberately forgotten so that she could not be traced. What followed over the next several hours was not magic, though those who witnessed it would later describe it in terms that suggested supernatural intervention. It was medicine, a different kind of medicine than the European doctors practiced, but medicine nonetheless. It was the accumulated knowledge of healers who had observed the human body for thousands of years, who had documented their findings not in textbooks but in oral traditions passed from elder to child, from grandmother to grandchild. Samuel prepared a tea from the bark and leaves, adjusting the proportions based on Elizabeth's weight and the severity of her symptoms. He added 3 drops of the dark liquid from the ancestral vial, no more no less, for the dosage had been calculated generations ago and had never failed when properly administered. The first challenge was getting Elizabeth to drink. She had refused all food and liquid for 2 days, her throat raw from coughing and her body too weak to swallow. Samuel asked Celia to raise the child's head, and he began administering the tea 1 drop at a time, massaging her throat gently to encourage the swallowing reflex. It took over an hour to get a single cup of the medicine into her. Samuel did not rush. He did not grow frustrated. He worked with a patience that seemed impossible in someone so young, a patience born from understanding that healing cannot be forced, only encouraged. Then he did something else. He began to sing. It was a song without words that the Baroness could understand, a melody that had traveled across the Atlantic in the memories of those who had survived the crossing. It was a song that Mama Essie had taught him, explaining that music was itself a medicine, that certain rhythms and tones could convince a body to fight when the will to live had been extinguished. Samuel sang as he prepared a poultice of the ground roots mixed with pig fat from the kitchen. He sang as he applied the poultice to Elizabeth's chest. He sang as the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, and the candles guttered in their holders, and the Baroness fell asleep in her chair for the first time in days. He was still singing when Elizabeth opened her eyes, truly opened them, not the glazed half-consciousness she had shown for weeks, and looked directly at him. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracked and weak, but unmistakably present. "Nobody important," Samuel replied. "Just someone who knows a different way to help." Within 3 days, Elizabeth's fever had broken. Within a week, she was sitting up in bed and asking for food. Within a month, she was walking in the gardens, weak but improving daily, the color returning to her cheeks and the life returning to her eyes. The 17th physician, Dr. Marcus Wellington of Baltimore, had written in his notes that the child would not survive until December. He had been wrong. Elizabeth Ashworth would live to see many Decembers. She would grow up, marry, have children of her own, and die of old age in 1923. 76 years after the night a 12-year-old enslaved boy did what 17 trained physicians could not. But the miracle of Elizabeth's recovery was only the beginning of the story. What happened next would demonstrate the true nature of a system built on the absolute denial of Black humanity. In the days immediately following Elizabeth's improvement, the Ashworth household entered a strange period of suspended reality. The Baron, who had prepared himself for his daughter's death, was forced to confront the fact that she had been saved by someone his entire worldview insisted was incapable of such an achievement. The Baroness, who had witnessed Samuel's treatment and could not deny what her own eyes had shown her, found herself unable to reconcile this experience with everything she had been taught to believe. And Samuel himself was returned to the quarters as if nothing had happened. No formal thanks was given. No improvement in his conditions was offered. He went back to his sleeping mat on the dirt floor of his grandmother's cabin, back to the pre-dawn hours of labor in the cotton fields, back to a life that continued as if he had not just accomplished what the finest medical minds of the age had failed to do. But whispers travel faster than anyone intends them to. Within weeks, the story of Elizabeth Ashworth's miraculous recovery had spread through the social networks of the Southern aristocracy like fire through dry cotton. Other families with sick children began making discreet inquiries. Other slave owners started examining their own human property with new eyes, wondering what other valuable skills might be hiding in the bodies they had always viewed as mere instruments of labor. The Baron found himself in an uncomfortable position. His daughter's survival was both a blessing and a threat. A blessing because she lived. A threat because her survival challenged the fundamental assertion upon which his entire way of life depended: that the enslaved people on his plantation were inferior, incapable, and rightfully owned. In the end, the Baron chose the path that so many before and after him would choose when faced with evidence that contradicted their self-serving beliefs. He chose to profit. Samuel was removed from the cotton fields and placed in a small building that had once been used to store tools. A sign was painted and hung above the door: Ashworth Medical Services. And the Baron began accepting payment from other plantation owners who wished to have their valuable human property treated by the boy who had saved his daughter's life. Notice what was not offered. Samuel received nothing. Not payment. Not improved living conditions. Not freedom. The profits from his skills went entirely to the Baron, who had discovered a new revenue stream that required no investment other than continuing to own the child who made it possible. Samuel was now working 16-hour days. In the morning, he would be brought cases, enslaved people from neighboring plantations who had been injured or sickened, whose owners were unwilling to lose the investment they represented, but equally unwilling to pay for white physicians. Samuel would diagnose and treat them using the knowledge Mama Essie had given him, the knowledge that stretched back across the ocean and through the centuries. In the evening, he would sometimes be called to the big houses of nearby plantations, ushered through back doors to treat white family members who were too embarrassed to admit publicly that they were seeking help from an enslaved child, but too desperate to let pride stand in the way of survival. Samuel saved lives. Many lives. And for each life saved, the Baron's accounts grew larger, while Samuel's chains grew heavier. But something else was happening as well. Something that the Baron did not anticipate and would not have understood even if he had known. With each patient Samuel treated, with each enslaved person he returned to health, a network was being built. A network of trust and information that operated entirely beneath the notice of the white power structure. Samuel was learning things: which plantations had the cruelest overseers, which owners were in financial trouble, which routes were used by the slave patrols, which conductors on the Underground Railroad could be trusted. And he was sharing this information, in whispers and coded messages, with a growing community of people who had begun to see him as something more than a healer. They began to see him as a hope. Mama Essie died in the spring of 1849. She passed quietly in her sleep, which was a mercy in a world that offered so few of them. Samuel was not permitted to attend her burial. There was a white patient waiting, and the Baron considered it a waste of valuable time for an enslaved person to mourn another enslaved person. But late that night, when the big house was dark and the overseers were sleeping off their whiskey, Samuel walked to the unmarked grave where his grandmother had been laid and stood in the darkness for a long time. "I understand now," he whispered to the earth that held her. "You didn't just teach me how to heal bodies. You taught me how to see, how to watch, how to wait. The medicine was never just about plants and roots. It was about knowledge itself, about the power of knowing things that others don't know you know." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small cloth bundle that he had kept hidden since Mama Essie's death. Inside were her healing tools, the grinding stones, the cutting implements, the small leather pouch containing the last drops of the ancestral liquid. These items should have been confiscated as property of the Baron. But Samuel had hidden them, and no one had thought to search the quarters of someone they considered less than human. "I'm going to finish what you started," he said to the grave. "I'm going to use what you taught me, not just to heal, to fight, to free. Every person I treat, every plantation I enter, every white household that invites me through their back door, they're letting the wolf into the sheep pen, and they don't even know it." He stayed until dawn began to lighten the horizon, then returned to his cabin, prepared the day's medicines, and went back to work as if nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Over the next 2 years, Samuel's reputation grew beyond anything the Baron had anticipated. He was now being transported to plantations as far as 50 miles away, treating cases that would have baffled European physicians. His success rate was remarkable. Not perfect, for no healer's rate is perfect, but far superior to the bleeding and blistering and poisoning that passed for advanced medicine in the white world. And with each treatment, Samuel gathered intelligence. He memorized the layouts of every plantation he visited. He noted which overseers drank heavily enough to be distracted at predictable times. He identified which enslaved people could be trusted, and which had been broken so thoroughly that they might inform on their own people in exchange for small favors. He cataloged the locations of swamps and forests that could provide cover for those attempting to escape, and he mapped the routes that connected these natural hiding places to the paths that led north. He shared this information through methods that would have seemed impossible to those who underestimated him. A certain pattern in the knots of a headcloth indicated that a conductor would be in a specific location at a specific time. A particular arrangement of herbs left outside a cabin door signaled that the plantation's patrols had been altered. A song sung while treating a patient could, in its rhythm and repetition, encode detailed instructions for those who knew how to listen. Samuel was 16 years old when the network he had built executed its first coordinated escape. 23 people fled from 5 different plantations on the same night, using routes that Samuel had mapped and signals that Samuel had designed. The chaos was magnificent. Search parties scrambled in multiple directions, unable to concentrate their forces because they didn't realize the escapes were connected. By the time dawn broke, the fugitives were miles away, moving through swamps that Samuel had identified as impassable to those unfamiliar with their hidden paths. 19 of the 23 made it to the north. 19 people who would live free lives, who would raise children in freedom, who would build communities that still exist today. The Baron never connected the escape to Samuel. None of the plantation owners did. The idea that an enslaved teenager could have organized something so sophisticated across such distances was simply inconceivable within their understanding of what black people were capable of achieving. And so Samuel continued, treating patients, gathering intelligence, building networks, waiting for the right moment to execute something even larger. That moment came in the summer of 1853. The fever that swept through the Ashworth plantation in July of that year was one of the worst in the region's history. It struck slave and master alike, though the enslaved people suffered far more severely due to their weakened conditions from overwork and malnutrition. Within 3 weeks, 27 people in the quarters had died, and the number was climbing daily. The Baron himself fell ill, as did most of his family. The only exception was Elizabeth, now 13 years old and still carrying whatever immunity Samuel's treatment had given her all those years ago. She moved through the sick house like a ghost, helping where she could, watching as the world her family had built began to crumble from within. Samuel was naturally overwhelmed with patience. He worked around the clock, treating both the enslaved workers whose survival the Baron required for economic reasons, and the white family members whose survival the Baron required for personal ones. He saved many lives during those terrible weeks. But he also made a decision. There were certain patients he could not save. The disease was too advanced, or their bodies were too weakened, or the treatment came too late. Samuel knew which cases were hopeless from the moment he examined them. A skilled healer learns to recognize when the battle has already been lost. But a skilled healer can also delay the recognition of that loss. A skilled healer can allow a dying person to appear as if recovery might still be possible, maintaining hope until the moment when hope transforms suddenly into mourning. Samuel used this skill strategically. The Baron died on August 3, 1853. Samuel had been treating him for 2 weeks, and to all appearances, he had been working diligently to save his owner's life. No one could have accused him of doing otherwise. His face showed the appropriate exhaustion and concern. His treatments were the same ones he would have used for any patient. But Samuel knew. He knew when he first examined the Baron that the disease had progressed too far. He knew that the treatments would prolong suffering without altering the outcome, and he had made the choice to let nature take its course while appearing to fight it. It was not murder. He had not poisoned the Baron or withheld genuinely life-saving treatment. He had simply recognized what the fever was going to do regardless of intervention, and he had declined to use his knowledge to steal from death the victory that death had already earned. The Baron died never knowing that the enslaved boy he had exploited for 6 years had possessed all along the power of that knowledge. What followed the Baron's death was chaos of a different kind. The estate was heavily in debt. Years of extravagant living had consumed far more than the plantation produced. The Baroness, overwhelmed by grief and illness, she would survive the fever but never fully recover her health, was unable to manage the complexities of an enterprise she had always left to her husband. The creditors circled. The auction was announced. Everything would be sold: the land, the house, the livestock, the human beings. Samuel knew the auction would separate him from everything and everyone he had ever known. He would be sold, probably to another plantation further south, where his skills would again be exploited and his intelligence again underestimated. The network he had built would be shattered. The people who depended on him for healing and hope would be scattered across the South, unless he acted. The night before the auction, Samuel moved. He had spent weeks preparing, using the confusion of the epidemic and the Baron's death to position people and gather supplies without detection. 17 enslaved people from the Ashworth plantation, including Celia who had first brought him to Elizabeth's bedside, slipped away from the quarters in the darkest hour before dawn. But Samuel did not go with them. He remained behind. He remained because he had one more thing to do. The Ashworth house was empty that night except for Elizabeth. Her mother was staying with relatives in Charleston, too ill to face the auction. The servants had either fled or been moved to the quarters for easier counting before the sale. Elizabeth sat alone in her bedroom, the same room where Samuel had saved her life 6 years earlier. Samuel climbed the trellis outside her window. He had done this before, in secret visits that no one knew about. Conversations between 2 children who had been connected by something that transcended the brutal categories their world had created. Elizabeth was not surprised to see him. She opened the window and stepped back, her face a mixture of fear and something else. Something that looked like relief. "You're leaving," she said. It was not a question. "I have to." "I know." She walked to her dresser and removed a small wooden box. Inside were coins, her personal savings, accumulated over years of birthday gifts and small indulgences. She pressed the box into Samuel's hands. "It's not much, but it might help." Samuel looked at the box, then at the girl who had once been dying, who was now a young woman standing at the edge of a world that was about to collapse around her. "Why?" he asked. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. "Because you saved my life. Because you're the only person who ever treated me like I was worth saving for reasons other than my father's name. Because—" She paused, struggling with words that her upbringing had never prepared her to speak. "Because this whole thing is wrong. Everything about it. I've known it since I was 7 years old, asking why the colored children couldn't come to my party, and no one ever gave me an answer that made sense." Samuel took the box. He had no words adequate for this moment. This strange, impossible connection between 2 people whom the world insisted should be enemies. "There's something else," Elizabeth said. She handed him a folded paper. "A letter. I wrote it myself with my mother's seal. It says you were freed in my father's will. It's a lie, but if anyone stops you, it might give you time." Samuel looked at the paper that could mean the difference between freedom and capture. A document forged by a 13-year-old girl who had decided to commit a crime against everything her family represented. "They'll know," he said. "Eventually, they'll find out what you did. Then I'll deal with that when it happens." Elizabeth straightened her spine in a gesture that reminded Samuel painfully of Mama Essie. "Some things are worth the consequences." Samuel left through the window as silently as he had come. He did not look back. He could not afford to carry the weight of that moment any further than necessary. He ran through the darkness toward the swamp, where the others were waiting. The forged paper pressed against his chest. The coins jingled softly in the wooden box. And behind him, a girl stood at her window watching until he disappeared into the shadows, knowing she would never see him again. The escape of the Ashworth 17, as it came to be known in the whispered histories of the enslaved community, was one of the most successful flights to freedom in the antebellum South. 16 of the 17 reached the North within 6 weeks, traveling through the network of safe houses and hidden routes that Samuel had spent years mapping. But Samuel himself was not among those who reached freedom. The search parties caught up with him in the swamps of northern Georgia, 3 weeks after the escape. He had stayed behind the main group, acting as a rear guard, creating false trails and misleading signs to confuse the pursuers. His knowledge of the landscape had bought the others precious time enough to reach the next station on the Underground Railroad, time enough to disappear into the network that would carry them to safety. By the time the slave catchers found Samuel, he was alone, exhausted, starving, but unbroken. The capture was reported in several newspapers of the time, though the accounts varied in their details. What is consistent across all reports is that Samuel did not attempt to flee when the dogs found him. He did not fight when the men surrounded him with their rifles and their chains. He simply stood in the shallow water of that Georgia swamp and waited. "You're that healing boy," one of the catchers said. "The one from Ashworth. There's a bounty on you bigger than any I've seen for a regular field hand." Samuel said nothing. "They say you're some kind of witch doctor. They say you can cure anything." Samuel looked at the man with eyes that held no fear. "I can heal," he said, "but I can't cure what's wrong with you." The journey back was brutal. Samuel was chained and transported in a wagon designed for livestock, denied adequate food and water, beaten for infractions both real and imagined. By the time they reached South Carolina, he was barely recognizable as the same boy who had walked into Elizabeth Ashworth's sick room 6 years earlier. But he was alive. And the network he had built continued to function even without him. In the 3 months between his capture and his execution, for that was always to be the outcome, the authorities having decided to make an example of him, 47 more enslaved people escaped using routes that Samuel had mapped and signals that Samuel had designed. Each escape was a message. The knowledge lived on. The hope could not be killed. Samuel was executed on December 12, 1853, in a public spectacle designed to terrify the enslaved population into submission. The official method was hanging, though witnesses reported that his body showed evidence of torture that had occurred in the days before his death. He was 18 years old. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. The stories began almost immediately after his death. Enslaved people on plantations throughout the South began reporting strange occurrences. A figure appearing at the edge of the swamp in the hour before dawn, pointing toward the north. Medicine pouches left outside the doors of cabins where sick children lay, containing remedies that no one remembered preparing. Songs drifting through the quarters at night, songs with no visible singer, songs that encoded the same instructions Samuel had taught. A woman in Virginia swore that she had seen Samuel standing at the foot of her bed the night before her daughter's fever broke, the same fever that had killed 3 other children on the plantation that week. She had not known Samuel personally, had never met him while he lived. But she described him perfectly, The serious eyes, the gentle hands, the quiet voice that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. A man in Mississippi reported that he had been lost in the swamps during an escape attempt, certain that he would be caught and returned to the torture that awaited captured runaways. And then a boy had appeared, a boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, though something in his eyes was ancient, and led him to a hidden path that took him all the way to the river where a boat was waiting. "Who are you?" the man had asked. "Nobody important," the boy had replied. "Just someone who knows a different way to help." The boy had vanished before dawn, leaving no footprints in the mud, no trace of his presence. But the man had reached the north. He had lived. He had told his story. These accounts multiplied over the years. Samuel became something more than a person. He became a symbol, a legend, a promise that the knowledge would survive even when the bodies that carried it were destroyed. People prayed to him as they would pray to a saint. They invoked his name in their healing rituals. They told their children about the boy who had turned the master's own arrogance into a weapon against him. Scholars would later debate whether the historical Samuel could possibly have done everything attributed to him. The documented record supports the basic facts: the healing of Elizabeth Ashworth, the years of medical practice, the organized escape of the Ashworth 17, the capture and execution. But the miracles that followed, the appearances, the impossible rescues, the cures from beyond the grave, these belong to a different kind of history. The history that people create when they need something to believe in. After the Civil War, when the enslaved people of the South finally walked into a freedom that men like Samuel had died trying to reach, his name began appearing in new contexts. Freedmen's schools were established in his memory. Healing traditions that traced their lineage back to his teachings were formalized and passed on. A cemetery in South Carolina, where his body was believed to have been buried in an unmarked grave, became a place of pilgrimage for those who remembered. The Ashworth plantation itself fell into ruin. The family scattered, their fortune dissolved by debt and war. Elizabeth Ashworth married a man from Massachusetts and moved north, never returning to the land where she had been raised. She lived to be an old woman, and, according to family letters discovered in the 1960s, she never forgot the boy who had saved her life and whose death she had been unable to prevent. In one letter, written to her own daughter in 1891, Elizabeth described that final night. "He came to my window to say goodbye, and I gave him everything I could: money, a forged letter, what little power I had. It was nothing. It was less than nothing compared to what he had given me. He gave me my life. He gave me the knowledge that the world I was born into was built on lies. He gave me something to believe in that was larger than myself. And all I could give him was a box of coins and a piece of paper that couldn't protect him in the end. I have lived with that failure for 40 years. I will die with it. It is the least I deserve." Today, if you know where to look, you can find traces of Samuel's legacy scattered throughout the American South. There are churches that still sing songs he taught, their rhythms encoding messages that no longer need to be secret, but are preserved nonetheless. There are families who practice healing traditions that trace their origins back to Mama Essie, and through her to the ancestors who carried their knowledge across the ocean. There is a small monument in South Carolina, erected in 1998, that bears his name, and the simple inscription: "He healed, he freed, he remembered." And on certain nights, they say, nights when the moon is dark and the swamp mist rises thick and white, you can still see a figure standing at the edge of the water. A boy who couldn't have been more than 12 years old, though something in his eyes is ancient. A boy who carries medicine in one hand and freedom in the other. He waits there, they say, for anyone who needs to find a different way. Like this video if Samuel's story touched your heart. Share so that his memory is never forgotten.